Well, where we left off last time was kind of in the middle of a topic, and the topic was the Second Continental Congress. And what I was looking at were the things that it accomplished. Now, you remember my point about the Second Continental Congress was that it was not really a government. We can't consider it a government, and then at that point we also cannot consider the United States a nation. They used the term the United States. They were speaking of themselves as the United States. But it really was not a country, because my point is that in order to be a country, you have to have a government, and in order to be a government, you have to be able to get money. I mean, that's the bottom line. Money is what you need. I mean, you can't function as a government without money. You can adopt resolutions and you can elect people and so forth like this. But if you really want to do anything, if you want to accomplish anything, you need money. And the way governments get money is by taxing. And the Congress, you remember, could not tax. The Americans had made a big point of it, and maybe they kind of had painted themselves into a corner on this, but they'd made a big point of no taxation without representation. And they had also made a big point out of insisting that representation meant what we call today, what political scientists call today, actual representation, as opposed to virtual representation, which Parliament said was the way it was, and Parliament then said we are representatives. But Americans had insisted that doesn't count. You can't accept that. They would not accept the idea of virtual representation. They insisted on actual representation, which meant they insisted that in order to be a representative, you had to be elected by the people. Okay. And the members of Congress were not elected by the people. They were elected by their state legislatures. I'm going to start using the term legislature. These are what we have been calling the colonial assemblies. We've been talking about that for up to this point in the class. We're going to start changing now and refer to them as state legislatures. We're going to accept the fact that it's a little bit premature so far. We're going to accept the fact that they are independent. We're going to call them states. And we're just going to use the word. It's just a terminology. It's just a changing of the word from the assembly to the legislature. And that's just a technical thing. It's a minor detail. But that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to talk about the state legislatures. And they elected the members of the Congress. So although they were elected by the people and they were representatives, the members of Congress were not. So we went through this, and I did this all with you last lecture. But then, as I said, now then, on the other side, and this is what makes it confusing and ambiguous and controversial, Congress did stuff that governments do. And so, maybe it's a government, maybe not. Maybe we can talk about the United States as a nation, maybe not. It's just, it's frustrating because it's so complex and it's so controversial, and it's just unclear, and they didn't understand it themselves, and they were themselves, the people who were involved in the Congress, were very confused about exactly what they were doing, what they could do, what they should try to be. There's just a lot of confusion and uncertainty about that whole question. And then some of it just comes down to, words, representative. What's a representative? And what can you accept as a representative and what doesn't count? So it's confusing. The things that Congress did were to get money. And they got it partly by printing it, which is something that is theoretically not right. The money they printed wasn't, by their own standards, was not real money. It was kind of fake money, but they printed it and they used it even though it was of very low value. And mostly they borrowed money. And with that borrowed money, then Congress did what its main concern was at that time, fought the war. I mean, that's what you had to do. You were involved in a war. They had to get an army. They had to appoint officers for the army. They had to provide supplies to the army. So that's why they needed money. They never did it very well. It was always very frustrating for General Washington to try to get along with the supplies that Congress could afford to buy for him. He never had enough. There were times when his army struggled. There were times when soldiers in the Continental Army died because the Congress could not provide enough money to buy blankets to keep them warm. Soldiers froze to death. Soldiers starved because they couldn't get adequate food. I mean, it was tough. But the point I made was they stuck it out. They stayed in there, and against great odds, they held their own against the much larger and better equipped and richer, better trained British Army. They didn't exactly defeat the British Army, but they didn't lose either. They hung in there, and when it finally came down to the end, and there was a battle that turned out to be decisive, I told you about the Battle of Yorktown. We won that battle. We won a lot of battles. We lost a lot of battles, but we won the Battle of Yorktown. And that was the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for England. After 6.5 years of fighting, they decided, just quit. This just is going to go on forever. Let's just pack it in and be done with it. And so, to that extent, the Americans did prevail. You can't exactly say they won the war, but sort of by not losing is almost kind of as good as winning. And so they did. And the soldiers in the Continental Army who had a very hard time, never had enough supplies, that sometimes died from starvation or freezing, but they got the job done. They were there. And so all credit to them and to the struggles that they encountered, and they did the best they could. They got it done. I mean, they had a lot of problems. They had, desertion was pretty high, and a lot of unhappy soldiers, but they did what had to be done. And you have to give Congress credit for it. They did a poor job of taking care of the army, but they took care of them enough that they were able to survive and come out with the same thing as a victory. Then another thing that I was talking about that Congress did as sort of an offshoot of that, just to remind you, because they were borrowing money from foreigners, and actually of all the money that we borrowed to pay for the war, about half of it came from Americans, half of it came from foreigners, especially the French and the Dutch bankers, and I think I mentioned the Spanish. The Spanish loaned us some gold, and we might have gotten, I don't know where else we got help, but we got help from various places in Europe. I know some Europeans, I think I told you, provided help in non-monetary forms. They helped us train the soldiers. There were foreigners who came over and were professional soldiers and helped train our army, which didn't have any professional soldiers. We had a lot of relations with foreign countries. And as I said, that's what governments do. And in 1778, we even signed a treaty with France. They signed a treaty. Countries, nations signed treaties. And in that treaty, France referred to the United States. And France called it a treaty between France and the United States. So they were talking about the United States as a country. So, that all has the idea that, all right, so Congress can't tax, but it can sign treaties, and only governments sign treaties. So, it's a sort of a government. And then, at the end of the hour, I was talking about something that Congress did, and it's very important, and I just barely got started on it, so I want to spend a little bit of time kind of filling in that gap today. It was Congress that made the decision to declare independence. Now, they declared it as the spokesperson for 13 states. So we're declaring independence as states, but it's all done by Congress, and it was stated as an act of a nation declaring its independence and becoming an independent nation of its own. Now, I told you that Congress decided to do that. Congress was the one that made the decision. It was a tough decision because nobody knew what the American people felt, what they wanted. Congress acted without knowing if the people were going to support them or not. We know that there were many loyalists who remained opposed to independence, still supported the king. We know that a lot of Americans felt that way. We don't know exactly how many, and neither did the members of Congress. They don't know if the people are going to support them or just totally reject them. I mean, they could make some guesses, but it was just guesses. I talked about Thomas Paine and the booklet Common Sense, which probably convinced a lot of Americans to support independence. And so the members of Congress knew that that little booklet had been widely read, much discussed. A lot of people knew about it. We have some copies of the original booklet as printed that are in museums or whatever. They're real, very prized artifacts. To have an original copy of the of Common Sense is a real collector's item. I have no idea what the price of that would be. It's huge. And there are some of them in museums, but all the ones that are out there are all in bad shape. They're dirty, they're torn, they're falling apart and everything like that, suggesting that they were passed from person to person, that they were handed around. So there were a lot of people read Common Sense, and very many of them finally realized, okay, it's time. And the big thing here is you have to turn the American people against the king. The fights had all been with Parliament, and we'd always been saying that it's Parliament is doing this and the king is our friend. Well, now we're going to have to switch sides on that. We're going to have to change course, and that's a little bit tough to do because we made sort of a big point of still saying that we were, we didn't like the taxes. Parliament can't tax us. Parliament's violating our rights. Parliament's doing all these terrible things, but the king is on our side. We love the king. Well, if you're going to become independent, you have to break that. You have to convince the American people, forget the king. The king is the bad guy, which is a little hard to do on the basis of the historical record up to that point. So when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, and I think I told you that it was written by a committee, largely written by Thomas Jefferson, and really what it is just a rehash of the ideas of John Locke, that John Locke had presented, nearly 80 years before, whatever the math is, as a justification for the glorious revolution of England of 1689. And now we're going to say for the same reason that it was okay for England to kick out James II in 1689, now it's okay for us to kick out George III in 1776. And it's the same reason. The king has failed to protect our rights. So actually most of the document, in terms of the volume of words, most of it is just an attack on the king. And if you look at it, there's sort of the introduction where they explain the theory of justifying revolution, but then the point is that now we can get a new government if the king fails to protect our rights. Here's the record. Here's all the terrible things that the king has done to indicate that he no longer respects and protects our basic rights. He's not doing his job, so we can get rid of him and get a new government to take his place. So a lot of it is just, if you look at if you read the document, you get through that first paragraph or two, and then it goes on to, well, the king, he's done this and he's done that, and he's done this, he's done that, and it's all a condemnation of the king. So you kind of think of the Declaration as partly propaganda to appeal to the American people, in the same way that Thomas Paine had done. Now we're trying to convince the American people, don't remain loyal to the king. That's what you've got to do. You don't have to convince them that Parliament is a bad actor. Americans have never really had any affiliation with Parliament. They never had any identification with Parliament. For them, being a British subject meant an attachment to King George III. That's what it meant to be a British subject. That's what it meant to have all these wonderful things that we got by being British subjects, which we've talked about, that we had all these rights and we were so happy to be British subjects. Well, now we got to change that, and that's a tough go. So from a standpoint of public opinion, the members of the Continental Congress had their work cut out for them. They had a job to do, and that's what the Declaration was trying to help, was trying to convince Americans to cut their tie, their historic, deeply felt ties to King George III. So there's all of that stuff in there. Just a couple of questions I would like to raise with you about the Declaration, though. It starts out with the phrase, all men are created equal. Well, that continues to trouble us. And if you've been following current events in the United States, you know that phrase still causes deep divisions within this country. It always has. There are two issues that we could raise about that. The terminology, all men are created equal. One of them is, did Jefferson and did the other members of the Continental Congress, whom we can call our quote-unquote founding fathers. The term founding fathers gets used in different ways, and it means different things depending on who uses it and for what reason. But if we're talking about the members of the Second Continental Congress as the founding fathers, they're the guys who made the decision to become independent. They generally looked on people, as we've said, as males. So all right, so Jefferson says men. Now, and Congress adopted that. I mean, that's the word they used. Men are created equal. Some historians have tried to suggest that, and for modern purposes, tried to suggest that we should use the word men not just as a gender-specific term, but rather speak about men as mankind, as humanity. And we do sometimes use that word men in ambiguous ways. There's a little bit of diciness about the term just as a word. Sometimes we say men meaning humanity. Was that what Jefferson had in mind? And there are people who are friends of Jefferson and so forth, and historians who want to make it that way. But, and this is certainly an arguable point from an historian's point of view, but my judgment is pretty clear, and I think most people would agree with me. No, they meant it as males. They were still in that old idea, which they've always been in, that people are white adult males. I'm sort of got ahead of myself here a little bit. But it's males. And so, yeah, it'd be nice if you could say, well, we're talking about all people. But I think what the founding fathers meant, what Jefferson meant, was just what it says, men, males, gender specific. So, for those of you who would like to say, oh, this is the greatest country ever, and we've fought for rights for everybody, well, males only. Let's not get carried away here. And a much more troublesome question, and a much more serious question is whether men referred to all males, including males of color. And that is one where historians have had a much more vigorous debate. The question of women, some people have tried to say to include women, but the evidence is not very strong in that one, so it doesn't lead to much of a debate because it's pretty clear that the answer is it's only for males. But it's a lot less clear about the status of slaves, Indians, and theoretically all men of color. And, people have gone back and forth on this. People have found quotes from Jefferson to indicate his disapproval of slavery. He did say things that indicated that he felt that we could not continue to have slavery in this country. And people have gone, there's a few little words that he said to that effect. So there are people who were trying to make him into a true hero and a great American and try to make America this country that stood for freedom for everybody. They've tried to extend that a little bit, but I'm a little leery of that. Yeah, there were times when Jefferson said that he thought maybe we couldn't keep slavery in this country forever, that, and the implication is that it was kind of contrary to the theory that all men are created equal. So that would mean that we would have to get rid of slavery sometime. But his record on that is a little bit unclear. And I think the record of Americans at that time is not very clear and not very favorable to an idea that we were including slaves and other men of color in the phrase, all men are created equal. That all rights belong to all men, all males. Certainly not women, but at least all males. No, to me, and I think, many historians, there are people who definitely argue that Jefferson was at the bottom trying to suggest we're going to have to get rid of slavery. I'm not convinced. I have to say, I'm afraid. When he said all men, he meant really all white men. He said that yeah, there was a quote where he said something to the effect that, it's clear we're probably not going to be able to keep slavery forever. But then he added, it's equally clear that we don't know what we'll do when we get rid of slaves. And to me, this is the sticking point that Jefferson and many other Americans died on. They could say slavery was wrong, we should get rid of it, but they could not then answer the next question. Well, if we get rid of slaves, what will happen to African Americans? What will happen to the former slaves? And they had no answer to that. The idea that we could somehow become a biracial nation, and even better, as long as we're talking about people of color, let's talk about Indians too, that we could become a multiracial culture. No, nobody could accept that idea. People could say, well, slavery's wrong, but then they just couldn't get the idea that somehow we could become this multiracial nation where people of different colors were friends, neighbors, spouses, parents, raising kids, just all black, white, red, whatever, all together, and just, people interacting just on the basis of people. They could not Americans could not get over the question of race. Racism was so deeply entrenched in American consciousness that people couldn't conceive of a world in which people were just all people, without regard to color, without regard to race. They just, I mean, racism was just built into every American. And so for people who didn't like slavery, they just crashed and burned when they had to ask the question, well, what will happen to the slaves after they're freed? And so they just shut down. They didn't go anywhere with it. The whole issue just got dropped. I don't talk about that. I can't think about that. I don't have an answer to that. So let's just drop it and let's not talk about it. And Jefferson, other people, other Americans who dislike slavery, one name that I like is John Adams. John Adams thought slavery was terrible. He didn't like it. He didn't want to see it in his country. But he couldn't figure out what to do about it. So he never did anything. He just, I mean, this is when you can't deal with a situation, you just don't deal with it. And he just didn't deal with it. I mean, nobody could. Nobody could come out and say, we've got to get rid of slavery, and we've got to then just be, together, and, the slaves will just become free laborers, and they'll work on farms, and they'll be just like other white people working on farms. Some of them will earn enough money to buy a farm. They'll become small farmers like everybody else. And if their kids end up marrying white people, well, so what? I mean, that's, people are people. And we'll just live together as one people. That was just outside of anybody's ability to think. So it just didn't happen. And that's why I think when Jefferson said all men are created equal, the best he could do was to say, well, yeah, it's got to be white men. It can't be anything else. We don't have an answer to know what we could do about slavery. So, yeah, all men are created equal. You don't need to put the word white in there. It's assumed. It's taken for granted. It's white men and white males, as a matter of fact. So let's not get too carried away with this idea that, these are our founding fathers who believed in freedom. Well, yeah, freedom for white males, all. So Congress adopted that, and they adopted then the Declaration of Independence. And Congress then also was responsible for negotiating a treaty when General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, and eventually England got around it. There were still other British troops in America, and actually George Washington was very worried about those British troops, and he kept telling Congress, wait a minute, the war's not over. You got to still come up with money, because we've still got to deal with the possibility that other troops will engage in battles against us. And they never did, but there were a lot of them, but eventually they all were withdrawn and sent back to England by English authorities. So then we started negotiating, and we went to France, to Paris. That's where you always have treaties. The Treaty of Paris, we're going to negotiate a treaty in 1783. It took a long time because technically we were allies of France, and France had certain things that they wanted to do in the treaty that related to their issues, had nothing to do with us. And France was an ally of Spain, and theoretically the treaty had to have the approval of Spain and France and the United States and England. All of them were going to have to be parties to it. But Spain had their issues with England, and they wanted to get that taken care of, so they wanted to get those into the treaty. Specifically, Spain wanted England to give it Gibraltar, which they never did and still have not. So if we stuck to that, the treaty would still not be signed today, because England still has Gibraltar and Spain didn't want to quit until they got Gibraltar. So all those other issues got involved. And eventually our negotiators, our delegates to the conference in Paris, said, "Oh, to hell with France and to hell with Spain. Let's just negotiate our own treaty and forget about them, because if we try to include them, and we'll never get a treaty done." They were right. I mean, we couldn't have had a treaty until England decided to give Gibraltar back to Spain. So who knows? Anyway, we eventually signed a treaty, the Treaty of Paris of 1783. And you have to give Congress credit for that. Congress was the one who responsible for our negotiators, the people that were actually there in Paris doing the negotiations. They got a real good treaty for the United States. And, they were working for Congress, getting their orders from Congress, being supported by Congress. So you have to give credit to Congress for doing a good thing, because the treaty was very, very favorable to the United States. Two basic issues. One, England recognized our independence. That's obviously the key thing. That's what the war was about. And on that, we got what we wanted. England recognized our independence as a nation. So that's a plus. And the other thing was that land in the West, which has been a big sticking point. That was what the proclamation line was all about. That's what the Quebec Act was all about. Americans want that land in the West, and England gave it to us. All that territory, from the Appalachians to the Mississippi River, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes, if you want to look at a map, that whole territory to the west, which France had given to England in the Treaty of 1763, now England gave that to us. So we got the land. That was one of the things we wanted. That's why we went to war, was to get that land, and we got it. England gave us that land. So the treaty was very favorable, and you have to give credit to Congress for negotiating that treaty. Another thing that Congress had to deal with was to try to make this whole process a little bit more official, more legal, do the things right, and basically clarify the status of Congress, which I've told you was very ambiguous. Is it a country or is it not? Is it a government or is it not? And people in Congress were aware of that and worried about it, and said, we can't just live with this ambiguity. We've got to get this straightened out. We've got to do this right. We've got to do it officially. And that meant we've got to write a constitution. We've got to have a formal constitution setting us up as some sort of a country. And it's got to be official. It's got to be a contract. It's got to be a legal document. Legal documents are contracts. And it's going to be a contract among the 13 states. We're now going to start calling them states instead of colonies. They are going to become states. And each state is going to have its own state government. And each of those state governments is going to ratify this constitution. It has to be done officially, like contracts. Contracts are negotiated. If you have a business contract, if you make a personal business contract to buy a car or whatever, you may get somebody who negotiates the contract. It's a document that somebody has prepared, but it's not valid until you sign it. You're the party. You have to approve it. The word that they use in legal circles is ratify. You have to ratify it. And so the contract has to be ratified by the 13 states. So Congress appointed a committee to draft a constitution, a formal legal contract. And this committee drafted what they called the Articles of Confederation. The name of this was the Articles of Confederation. And it was approved by Congress sometime in, I think, 1777. The Congress had been meeting for a year or two, and this committee produced this document after a lot of discussion and committee meetings and so forth. They came up with a constitution that they called the Articles of Confederation. And basically what that did was to sort of put into writing what Congress had been doing all along. The Articles of Confederation established that the government would be in the hands of a Congress. So that word, which had started out back in the days of the Stamp Act Congress back in 1763, 64, it had meant a meeting. The word has sort of evolved into now it's a governing body. So that's how the word Congress had sort of changed in its meaning from over time there. It had sort of transitioned from a meeting to now a governing body. So the government under the Articles is in the hands of Congress, which is what it had been anyway. I mean, it's all they're sort of doing is just saying, putting in writing what they're doing in practice. And that meant that the Congress, members of Congress would be elected as had been the case ever since they started back in April of 1775 after the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Congress is going to be elected, the members of Congress will be elected by state legislatures. And they will be able to do many of the things that Congress had been doing anyway. They will be able to have an army, and they added a navy, although we never really got around to that, but an army and a navy. They'll be able to negotiate treaties, which Congress was going to do. They negotiated the treaty with France in 1778 and then with England itself in 1783. So Congress can negotiate treaties. That means that Congress can declare war and make peace. You know, that's what you do. And they'll carry on foreign relations with other countries. I mean, that's what Congress was doing. We'll be able to legally now carry out formal negotiations between Congress acting for the 13 states and foreign countries, and which is what they were doing anyway. And then the Articles also specified that Indian tribes would be treated as foreign nations, which we had always regarded them as, and that was a very poor analogy. If you remember my talking about Indians at the very beginning of the semester, Indians didn't really have nations. They didn't think of themselves as nations. They were just people, and they just had little communities of people. But white people always insisted on wanting to have them to become nations, so we're still going to call them nations, and then negotiations with the Indians will be the same as with other foreign nations. It will be handled by Congress. And then there were some housekeeping things that Congress could do. Congress could establish a post office to facilitate communication among the 13 states. Congress could adopt a common unit of money that would be used by all states, so that everybody would be using the same idea of money. You wouldn't have to have exchanges between the currency used in New York and other states or whatever. You know, they'd all be using the same currency, and Congress would establish what that would be. Congress would also establish a uniform system of weights and measures, just to facilitate trade among the states. That, you know, a bushel would be the same in one state as in all states. You know, and Congress would do just the basic physics of defining a bushel and a yard and whatever. And they would adopt standards that all states would use. And the idea of that is to promote trade and commerce among the states. They're all going to be using the same money and the same units of measure and so forth. So they'll just facilitate trade. So Congress is going to do many things that they were already doing and would be the work of a government. But there were two big things Congress could not do. First, and in no particular order, Congress could not regulate trade. Trade regulation was still in the hands of the states. So Congress could facilitate trade, but actually setting up the rules under which it would be conducted, setting up such things as if there are going to be tariffs on imports, all these other things involving trade, all of that was left up to the states and not within the purview of Congress. So Congress could not do one important thing to treat the United States as a nation with one trade policy, one set of trade laws. Trade laws were in the hands of the states, not Congress. So that was a very, it turns out it's a very, very important issue. And we'll talk about how that is going to sort of unravel Congress when we get to it. And then the other thing Congress could not do, we already talked about a lot, Congress could not tax. So Congress could not reliably get money. Now they could borrow money, and you know, if you borrow money, you've got money and you can spend it. But borrowing money depends on finding somebody who's willing to lend it to you. And you don't control that. The people who have the money control that. So that's an important issue. You know, if somebody else has to decide if they want to pay you, yeah, if they do, that's great. But what if nobody does? And a lot of times, when people are willing to lend money, they sort of want to have some assurance that they're going to be able to get it back, that you're going to be able to repay the money that you borrow. And there was no way for Congress to do that. You know, how can Congress guarantee that they're going to repay money when the bottom line is they still can't tax? Now, they'd been able to borrow money during the Revolution, during the war, and they were still doing it when they were still talking about this, the Articles of Confederation. They were still out frantically borrowing money from any American they would lend it to them. But they couldn't promise the people that they're going to repay it, which to me says, man, those guys who supported the revolution, the wealthy Americans who loaned money, they're really going out on a limb. And I think about myself. If I were a rich guy living in the United States and during the Revolution, would I have wanted to lend money to Congress with no assurance that I'll ever get the money back? I like to tell students in class when I have in the classroom that I like to invite any of them, if they're willing to make a loan with no guarantee that it'll be repaid, see me after class, because I can help you. But if you can't repay a loan, can you really get it? I mean, there's no guaranteed way. So Congress does not have a way to get money. They have the legal right. The article said that Congress can borrow money. But so what? You know, if nobody wants to lend it to them, what good is it? And that's the two things that Congress could not do, that in some ways overshadowed what they could do. And without those two things, I would say the Articles of Confederation is not a true constitution. It does not establish a true government, and we cannot then, bottom line, think of the United States as a nation. I mean, it's doing all sorts of stuff, and those are important, but without control over the trade of the country as a country, without the right to tax, it's not really a government. So it's, and it's a tough thing, because as I keep saying, yeah, it does stuff the governments do, but it just doesn't count. All right, so Congress appointed a committee that drafted this, and after discussion and some as is always the case when you have an important document decided upon by a body, a legislative body, club or anything, whatever it is, there were amendments to it and it was tinkered with, but basically Congress adopted them. And now it has to be ratified by the states. It has to be ratified by all 13 states. I mean, this is a contract to establish the United States. All parties, and the parties are the states. It's a contract among the states, so it has to be ratified by the states, and it has to be ratified by all of them. Well, of course, you know, there was people wanted to get this done. I mean, everybody was all very nervous about the fact that, you know, here's Congress doing this stuff, and the war is going on, and we're sending people off to die, and we're fighting battles, and we're borrowing money and doing this, and it's not official. Everybody feels we got to get it official. So there's a lot of support for ratifying the Articles of Confederation. And then one state refused. Huh? What? Why? The state was Maryland. Maryland? What the hell is wrong with Maryland? And people, I'm just saying what people that said, you know, everybody's in favor of it, and then here's one state refusing to ratify. And they're not objecting to the articles. It's not like they say, well, we don't agree with the articles. It's not like they're saying we want to give Congress more power, we don't want to give it less power. They don't have any disagreement with the articles. They've got something else that's on their mind that has nothing to do with the articles, but they're using it as a tool to get out after the other states and just use this whole business that they have to ratify, and if they don't, then the whole thing fails, and so they say, well, we're just not going to do it unless we get something else that we want. And I don't think it's obvious. Sometimes in class I like to ask students if they can figure out what's going on with Maryland, and people don't get it because it's just not clear, and it's weird. Maryland is really weird. Maryland's big rival, and they were really after just one state. They weren't after all of the other states. They were just after one. They were after Virginia. Virginia and Maryland are neighbors. They're right next to each other. They have a very similar economy. They're both right in that tobacco growing Chesapeake Bay region. They've been rivals forever. They're two of the earliest colonies, and they'd always been sort of competitors. And always Virginia was much bigger. Virginia is a very large state. It's the largest state in the country at that time, both in population and in area. Virginia is the largest state. Maryland is a relatively small state. So Maryland has always been overshadowed by its big, fat neighbor next door, Virginia. And there's always been a lot of hostility against Virginia. And one of the things is that I've alluded to, Virginia claims all of that land in the West. All of that we got from England in the treaty, and the treaty hasn't even been signed yet. We don't even know if we're going to get it. But Virginia is sort of anticipating that we're going to get it from England, and that it's going to be Virginia's, because their charter, which had been adopted back in 1606, gave what was then the Virginia Company all of that land. When the company went away, then it was replaced by the Virginia State Legislature, which was called the House of Burgesses, if you remember back in those days. And it's always been under the control of the House of Burgesses, or at least they've claimed it as theirs, and they still do. So here's Virginia, which is already the largest state in the country, much bigger, much richer, much more powerful than little dinky Maryland next door. And Virginia wants all of that additional land. They want to get even bigger and richer and more powerful. And Maryland just doesn't want it to happen. And Maryland says, we won't ratify the articles. As I say, this is what they're after. They're after Virginia. They're not trying to stop the articles. They just want to get Virginia. They say, we won't ratify the articles unless Virginia does what we want. And what they want Virginia to do is a little bit complicated, and there are some options, and different people in Maryland actually had different ideas about what they wanted. But what it came down to that they wanted Virginia to relinquish its claim to that land in the West. They want Virginia to turn that land in the West over to Congress. Have that land not be run by any one state. Virginia claims it all. There are other states that have claims there, so it's a complicated issue. But the other states that have claims have much smaller land, and they just have little parts of land within the big Virginia claim. And so you've got all of these disputes among states to straighten out. And Maryland just says, we want Virginia to relinquish its claim to Congress. Not let any one state, not let any state have any claims to that land in the West. Put it all under the jurisdiction of Congress. And they want to do it to keep it out of the hands of Virginia. They want to do it as a way to keep Virginia from becoming even bigger than it already is, and even and dominate them even more than it already does and has forever. And in 1781, Virginia agreed. After a couple of years of arguing about this, and everybody saying bad things about Maryland because they were blocking the whole ratification, and everybody wants to get it ratified. And here's Maryland just being stubborn and saying we're not going to ratify unless we get what we want. They got what they wanted. Virginia relinquished that claim. Now that was not a popular issue within the state of Virginia. The legislature agreed to it, but many people in the state were very unhappy with their legislature because many people in that state had, as I've told you, dreams of getting their hands on some of that land through the Virginia legislature, which they sort of knew somebody, or they had somebody, or they were members of, or whatever. They've got some ties to the legislature, and they figure we're going to get what's, corruption here. We're going to get some of that land out of the Virginia legislature, and we're going to own that land. And then, as I've told you, in the day, whenever it happens, that we solve the New Orleans problem, then people are going to want to start moving onto that land, and we'll own it, and we'll sell it to them, and we'll get rich. And now they can't do it, because Virginia's not going to have that land. It's going to be in the hands of Congress. And there were a lot of people unhappy about that. But the governor of Virginia, at that time, 1781, convinced the legislature to make that sacrifice. And as I say, politically, a lot of people in the state hated him. And his name is not a surprise. It was Thomas Jefferson. We have to understand why Jefferson convinced Virginia to give up this land in a decision that was not popular within the state. Jefferson is committed to the idea of a Republican government. And in his view, and in the view of what we would call today political scientists, in those days they were political philosophers or whatever, people have been talking about the idea of a republic forever. And the idea of a republic is that it is government by elected representatives of the people. But there had always been, in the theory of a republic, always the idea that it could only work in a small state, a small country. That you have to have representatives who are kind of close to the people, can understand the people. You have to have kind of a small, manageable state in which the whole idea of a republic can flourish, because you've got representatives who will be elected by people who sort of know them, that people will elect representatives as the people that they will elect as their representatives, or people that they know and that they're familiar with, and that the representatives sort of are close to the people, they know the people they represent, they know what the people they represent want, and they can act accordingly. If you get a big, huge state, it's going to be so big that nobody will know the representatives, and the representatives won't be able to be close to the people, and it won't work. And Jefferson wanted Virginia to remain a republic. So he said, we're already pretty big, let's not get bigger. Let's remain small. Small is beautiful. A republic works best when it's small and when representatives can effectively, meaningfully represent the people. And that's what it's all about. It's all on having representatives. So he convinced the legislature to make that sacrifice, and politically, as I said, it was a very unpopular decision, but he got it done. And it's something I want you to understand, because there is this whole idea that Jefferson is presenting here of America as a republican country, and republics should have small states. So this has great significance for our future, and it's important to understand that here's Jefferson making an issue of this very early in 1781. But he got it done. Maryland ratified the Articles, and we went on from there. And we will go on from there in our next class. Now for today, your little essay, or short essay, little short statement that you make, I'm going to ask you to summarize some of the accomplishments of the Second Continental Congress. Right, just a couple of sentences describing some of the things that the Second Continental Congress accomplished during its existence. It went out of existence in March of 1781 when it was replaced by the Confederation Congress. So technically it was the Confederation Congress, same thing after March of 1781 when the Articles got ratified. And we'll pick that up in our next class.